I mean, one of the problems is that organised crime gangs don't have to go through treasury procurement exercises in order to get new kit, and that certainly has an effect.
Hello and welcome to this special Saturday edition of Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by Charlie Taylor, who is HM Chief Inspector of Prisons in this country. Now, Charlie, there have been figures released this week saying that there were 91 accident releases between April and October of this year. Can you just tell us why that is?
Well, it comes as absolutely no surprise, and we saw 262 in the year before and a big increase in the year before that. What it's really a symptom of is a couple of things. First of all, it's the amount of churn that we've seen in terms of changes of policy when it comes to release. So under the Conservative government, we had the early release of 18 days, then it went up to 30 days, then it went up to, I think, 40, then it went up to 70. And then this government came in and they introduced what was called STS 40, where in the past, prisoners used to serve 50% of their sentence. They're now expected to serve 40% of their sentence. So the system has just got much more complicated over the course of the year. For people in prison, they've sometimes failed to keep up. And the other thing, I think, is the lack of experience and lack of training that we see in many prisons. And in the old days, the way that training used to work in prison is no one gave you much formal training. But what happened is there was a very experienced person around there, and they would sit next to you and they'd say, "You're getting that all wrong. This is how you do it." But unfortunately, we don't have the experienced person sitting next to them anymore, in which case you've got very inexperienced people leading other very inexperienced people. And that's been a cause of lots of these issues that we're seeing, not just when it comes to releases, but also in other bits of the system as well. And
that lack of experienced staff, is that due to staff retention, the rates collapsing? Or
Yeah, it's due to staff retention, which has been poor for many years, where there's a push to fill the pipeline at all time. Prisons are recruiting like mad, but they're not always recruiting people who are going to stick around for very long. And one of the things that I've complained about in my time as Chief Inspector is the fact that governors have no say over the people who come and work in their prison. So the first time you meet new officers is when they walk onto the wing for the first time, which and governors often say, "Look, these guys aren't going to make it. You know, I can tell from very early on that this person isn't up to it." So it means you then go through a process of that person going, another new person arrives.
That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of the sort of staff being hired, I mean, are there enough people in the right jobs on the estate? Because, I mean, overall staff numbers have gone up over the past 10 years or so.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's interesting because you go to private sector prisons and some of those actually have lower staffing levels, but they can be more successful. So probably the best prison in the country is actually HMP Oakwood, just north of Wolverhampton, where they have some economies of scale. It's the biggest jail in the country and it's relatively new, so it's in decent nick. But actually it's also, as well as being the most successful prison in the country, it's also the least well-funded prison in the country as well.
And why is that so successful? What lessons can we learn from somewhere like that?
Well, I mean, I wish the prison service would ask this question themselves as well, because there's a huge amount that can be learned. I mean, I think what Oakwood are able to do is to innovate. So they're able to take risks, to do things differently in a way that I think sometimes the prison service is very nervous about doing. For example, when it comes to visits at Oakwood, there's an opportunity to be able to bring your dog in if it's very well behaved, if you're a prisoner who's proved that you're really well behaved and you're going to do the right thing. So I came across, when I visited the jail, there was a guy, ex-services guy, who got himself into trouble. He was doing 2 years for whatever he'd done. And his dad had brought his dog in that he hadn't seen for 2 years. And it was an amazing thing. And for that prisoner, he's not going to break the rules anymore in that jail because, there is such an incentive for him to behave and to be able to. So Oakwood just thinks about ways in which they can incentivize prisoners to behave all the time, as well as being really clear about standards that they expect. So you muck about at Oakwood, you're in trouble. But if you do the right thing, there are all kinds of opportunities that open out for you. And
you talk about innovation there. I mean, what are the challenges that technology is presenting for the prison estate? Because, I mean, drones has been something that's featured in parliamentary debates before. How harder is it nowadays to kind of keep order in these prisons?
Well, drones have represented a new paradigm when it comes to prisons and prison security, because not only with the accuracy by which they can be dropped off at individual cells using apps like What Three Words, but also just the size of the packages that are now getting into prisons. So the other day, a head of security sent me a list of the contents of a package that arrived in their jail. And it was astonishing. As well as having bales of cannabis coming in, there was also ketamine, there was also methamphetamine, there was cocaine, But on top of that, there were 3 different types of anabolic steroid for the bodybuilders in the jail. There was minoxidil, which you may or may not know is a hair loss medication. We've even seen things like Ozempic being ordered to coming into prisons as well. So with real accuracy, organised crime gangs are able to drop off large amounts of contraband into prisons and are often making enormous amounts of money as a result of it. And the prison service seems at times to be disabled in its response, and prisoners are moving far. I mean, one of the problems is that organised crime gangs don't have to go through Treasury procurement exercises in order to get new kit, and that certainly has an effect. But we inspected HMP Manchester, where they were putting new windows in place because they'd all been broken to let drones drop off. Some of the guys who were fitting the new windows were actually getting a knock on the door at home from undesirable characters saying, "I don't think you want to carry on doing the work that you're doing." Actually, as it turned out, the windows were breachable anyway, because prisoners realised quite quickly they could rip the element out of their kettle and burn a hole through the window, and so the drones could carry on delivering. So they've now got new windows being put into Manchester. But there are sophisticated organised crime gangs who are making an enormous amount of money out of prisons, and where you get drugs in prison, you get debt, and where you get debt gets settled by violence. But the other thing that we have no idea of the scale of is the extent to which this is also affecting families on the outside as well. So we know there's a huge value of drugs getting into prison, and we also know that prisoners themselves haven't always got very much money, and that gap is being filled by something, and I suspect it's being filled by Granny and Grandad going down to the building society, withdrawing their savings so that their son doesn't get beaten up or their grandson doesn't get beaten up.
And also, you talk about this kit element. I mean, one thing that's featured in terms of the debates on accidental early releases is the fact that some of the processing hasn't been digitised. Could you just explain why that is?
Yeah, I mean, it was traditionally done with a pencil and paper and a calculator.
It's like a porridge or something.
And it is, and it probably hasn't changed that much over the years. And it is really complicated because what you have is different prisoners. So if there's one prisoner serving one sentence for one offence, that's fine. But what for so many prisoners you have is they've actually they've committed an offence. They're serving 2 different sentences for other offences. It may be that the sentence runs concurrently, or it may be the sentence is consecutive. They may have been remanded for another offence, or they may not have been, or they may have been bailed for a further offence or for a further charge. And they may be an immigration case, in which case they're due to be deported. But as we saw in the recent case, the deportation, for whatever reason, didn't happen. So there is something about the complications of the system, the many changes that ministers have had to make, really just to stop the prison service, the prison estate from falling over with overcrowding. But also what it's done, these levels of overcrowding, is increase the churn within so many prisons. So you go to a jail like Chelmsford, and it's just unbelievably busy. Almost everybody there is on remand. So the prison has to get everybody off to court in the morning. Then you've got all the releases you've got to do over the course of the day. Then the court guys come back from court and you've got new cases coming in. So the churn is big, the lack of experience of staff, and the clunkiness of the system that we've got against a fast-moving, quickly changing release environment where sentence lengths and tariffs have become ever more complicated.
And in terms of policy making, I mean, obviously, as you say, the new government came in last year and had to do this sort of early release and all the sentencing changes because of sort of the need to respond to that. I mean, what more can be kind of done to stop the kind of embarrassing spectacle of some of these recent accidental early releases we've seen?
Well, I think the lack of training that we see so often in prisons is a huge issue here. So if people don't really know what they're doing, and there's another new bit of guidance coming out, then people just really struggle to be able to follow it at the rate that they would need to be doing it. And there have been just such a string of rapid changes that have happened over the years. So it's just made things more difficult. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is as well as mistakes being made in courts as well. The guy who came out of Wandsworth the other day was given a 4-year sentence, but actually the warrant from the court said that it was a suspended sentence. So the prison had no choice but to let the guy out. So it tends to come either from the courts or from the prison, but usually it is an error from the prison. And the thing that hasn't got mentioned much this week, but is also a big issue, in the last year, I think there were 16 early releases from Pentonville, which is top of the pops when it comes to these errors. But actually what we found when we inspected Pentonville earlier in the summer is something like nearly a quarter of prisoners in the last 6 months had actually been released late as well. So they've been kept in beyond the end of their sentence.
And does that pose an issue as well in terms of, would they be able to kind of sue for compensation or something?
Oh yeah, they would. Yeah. There is a way in which they can do that. Certainly, yeah. And it's no good having a justice system that lets people out early, but it's also no good having one that keeps people beyond the end of their sentence, particularly when we have an overcrowding crisis.
And how much this, I mean, you talked about some of the innovations in private prisons and privately run prisons. I mean, it's often said in debates around justice about Britain's sort of traditionally Victorian crumbling buildings, etc. I mean, is that playing a factor in all of this, or was it kind of irrelevant, or is it more about manpower as opposed to the estate?
Oh, no, the estate is certainly an issue, because what you find is the busiest, most overcrowded prisons are also the oldest and the most crumbling. So somewhere like Pentonville has 1,200 prisoners, about 1,100 prisoners in it, and it was built originally for about 600. So it's on a very small footprint, which means there isn't enough space for prisoners to be able to do stuff during the day, work, training, education, the sort of thing the public would want prisoners to be doing in order that they come out and don't commit further offences. So that's certainly an issue, but also just the difficulties with getting infrastructure fixed. So we inspected a Lincoln, which is another old stunning Victorian building. There'd been a boiler house built 7 years ago, but they haven't put the boiler in. So the prison has been running off temporary boilers for many, many years. And the cost of those temporary boilers would have been way more than the cost of just simply getting them replaced. But the time it takes, the sclerotic pace at which procurement of stuff in prisons takes just means that we get everywhere we go, particularly in the older prisons, there are cables everywhere because there are generator sets and there are temporary fridges and temporary kitchens and those sorts of things in place.
And I mean, obviously last week, David Lammy, after a somewhat unfortunate Prime Minister's questions, then went and attended a new ground digging ceremony for a new prison. I mean, what will Labour's plans actually make a meaningful dent in all of this, given, of course, and in fairness to them, they have to make up for the prison state suffering some of the cuts under the justice budget over the past 14 years or so?
Yes, so there's lots of building work going on all over the country, not only new prisons such as the one at Gartree that Secretary of State opened last week, but also that lots of building work in building extra wings in prisons. I mean, one of the things that worries me about that is you've got to make sure that you build enough activity spaces as well, because what you don't want is prisoners locked in their cells all day with nothing to do for 22 hours, because inevitably they will take what they call bird killers drugs in order just to get through the day. So making sure there's enough to really keep prisoners busy and having a sense of progression is very important. But we'll wait and see, because the numbers of people coming into prison will continue to increase over time, and whether MOJ have got those projections right and whether the Gawk reforms will give them the headroom that they want. But I think it's really worth saying that these changes will stop the prisons being in the dire state where they're about to fall over, where we're having to use police cells because there isn't space in prisons. But what it won't stop is the extreme overcrowding that we're seeing in so many of the jails around the country. And that's a separate issue, which is the cause of many of the problems that we see on inspection.
And how is the sort of dynamics and demographics of the prison population changing? Because, I mean, I remember when I was a reporter in Scotland and I was talking to one police officer there, and he talked about how Albanians had basically driven a lot of the traditional crime out there. How are those sort of changed over the past 10 years or so?
Well, I think you see different groups of prisoners depending on, I mean, for example, a few years ago, there were a lot of Vietnamese who were involved in cannabis farming, and there were a number of those. Actually, there seem to be fewer of those. They've served their time and probably in some cases have been deported. So you do see kind of shifting sands when it comes to those sorts of things. I think the other thing has been the many and the great success by the police and the National Crime Agency over the Encro chat and the number who've been convicted, and they caught some really big players as a result of that. But of course, just because you put a criminal in prison, it doesn't mean they want to stop committing crime. And I suspect there's certainly a correlation between those guys coming into prison and the amount of sophisticated drugs and operations that are now able to happen. You know, these are people who can move product around the world. These are people who can move money around the world very quickly. And therefore, why would they stop doing crime just because they're in prison?
And, we had a lot of focus on manhunts recently. You remember, I think it was last year, there's the Daniel Khalif case. And obviously we had Kabatu. I mean, when that happens, how does it work for the prison? I mean, how involved are they in the kind of subsequent manhunt to get that person back into captivity?
It's handed over to the police. That will be the police's job. But, the police have got better things to do than chasing around after prisoners who've been wrongfully released by the prison service. So it's an unfortunate situation.
And so you think that these kind of stories that we had is unfortunately going to be, at least for the short term, British politics, a kind of constant feature, particularly, of course, because you've got Robert Jenrick, who's very much the heat-seeking howitzer of the Tory front bench, determined to make a big story out of this.
Yeah, I mean, the Secretary of State has introduced some new measures, and there's a big push towards, and we're hearing lots of talk about digital, but this stuff takes time. And in the meantime, with the further changes taking place from 40% to 30% of prisoners willing to have 30% of their sentence under the Gawk changes in the bill that's going through at the moment, it's almost inevitable that it's going to be hard to get rid of this issue with early releases or indeed late releases. So I suspect we may be hearing more of this over the course of the next year.
Well, I'm sure we'll be discussing that on Coffee House Shots. Charlie Taylor, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.